For centuries, Appalachian roots were buried in myth. Now, ancient DNA finally reveals the truth about the Scots-Irish, a resilient genetic tapestry shaped by brutal border wars and untamed frontiers. We've all heard the basic story: poverty, persecution, a hunger for free land. These same forces pushed millions of Europeans toward Ellis Island, toward the tenements of Boston and the stockyards of Chicago. But the people I'm talking about today didn't come through Ellis Island. They didn't even come from the same desperate centuries as those later waves. The Scots-Irish reached these shores over 300 years earlier, and the home they carved out wasn't a city street. It was the misty hollows and ridgelines of southern Appalachia, and buried inside their bloodline is a story far older and stranger than anyone realized. A story written across thousands of years of European migration, conquest, and survival, long before a single ship ever left port. Before we get into it, a like and a subscribe helps this channel keep going. Now, to understand where these people really came from, we have to go back to one king, one crown, and one decision that would change Ireland, Scotland, and eventually Appalachia forever. Long before anyone called themselves Scottish or Irish or anything else, the land we now call Scotland was empty ice. Around 12,000 years ago, as the last glaciers finally retreated, the first humans moved in. These were Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, small nomadic bands following the melting ice north, living off fish, deer, and whatever the forest gave up. Their genetic fingerprint on modern Scots is faint today, but it never fully disappeared. Then, around 6,000 years ago, everything changed. A new wave of people arrived from the Near East and Anatolia, bringing something the hunter-gatherers never had: agriculture. These Neolithic farmers didn't just bring crops and livestock, they brought permanence. They built monuments, meant to outlast generations. Structures like the Callanish stones on the Isle of Lewis and the Ring of Brodgar in Orkney. Stone circles still standing thousands of years later. Their genetic legacy ran deep, and for a while, it looked like farming culture would define the land forever. It didn't last. Around 4,500 years ago, a new people showed up carrying distinctive bell-shaped pottery, and historians now simply call them the Beaker people. What they did to the existing gene pool was staggering. Some genetic studies suggest Beaker migrants replaced as much as 90% of the local Neolithic population's ancestry. 90%. An entire genetic identity, nearly erased and rewritten within a few generations. Then came the Bronze Age, and with it, the Celts. Originating in Central Europe, these tribal societies didn't necessarily conquer the land by force. Instead, the evidence suggests something subtler. Local populations gradually adopted Celtic language, technology, and religious practice rather than being wiped out and replaced. Gaelic took root, especially in the Western Highlands, while a separate language, likely Pictish, held on in the East for centuries longer. This blending of peoples would echo again centuries later, across an ocean. So by the time anyone could call this land Scotland, its people were already a blend of hunters, farmers, beaker-bearing newcomers, and Celtic tribes, layered on top of each other like sediment. And that layering was only the beginning. By the Iron Age, roughly 2,800 years ago, a new name enters the story: the Picts. The Romans called them Picti, the painted people, and they dominated what's now northern and eastern Scotland for centuries. Genetically, though, they weren't some separate race dropped in from elsewhere. Studies suggest the Picts looked a lot like other Iron Age populations across Britain, with their own regional flavor concentrated in the northeast. Rome itself barely touched Scotland. The empire built a wall and called it good enough. Hadrian's successors pushed the frontier further north, building the Antonine Wall, but it didn't last. And what little Mediterranean DNA shows up in the south today is a faint footnote compared to everything else layered into the bloodline. The real disruption came later, with longships on the horizon. Starting around 793 AD and running for nearly 3 centuries, Norse raiders and settlers transformed the genetic map of Scotland's north. In Orkney, roughly a quarter of the population's DNA traces back to Norway. In Shetland, it's nearly identical. Even on the mainland, Norwegian ancestry shows up at lower but still measurable levels, averaging around 4%. This is where something fascinating starts to take shape. Modern genetic mapping of Scotland reveals a clear divide running roughly along the line of the River Forth, separating northeast from southwest. That line lines up almost exactly with the old territorial boundary between the Picts and the Gaels. Centuries after both groups supposedly vanished into a unified Scottish identity, their genetic fingerprint still splits the country in two. And the Hebrides, those scattered islands off the west coast, turned out to be their own genetic island entirely, isolated enough over time to develop a distinct signature found nowhere else in Scotland. So, in truth, by the time the medieval period rolled around, Scottish wasn't one bloodline. It was Pict and Gael, Norse raider and native islander, mainland farmer and isolated Highlander, all stitched together but never fully blended. And every wave that followed, Norman, Flemish, Irish, would land on top of a population that was already, genetically speaking, a patchwork. In 1603, a single man inherited 2 crowns at once. James, the 6th of Scotland, became James the 1st of England. And with that, the idea of a united Britain finally had a ruler determined to make it real. James wasn't satisfied with just merging paperwork. He wanted permanence, a lasting Protestant kingdom that wouldn't unravel the moment he died. But sitting right in the middle of that ambition was Ireland, a problem English kings had been wrestling with for centuries. Parts of the island had technically belonged to the English crown since the 1170s, but Gaelic chieftains never fully accepted it. Catholic Ireland kept fighting, kept resisting, and worse, from London's perspective, kept welcoming Catholic Spain as an ally against the English. Then, in 1593, a brutal 9-year conflict known as Tyrone's Rebellion broke out, pitting a confederacy of Irish clans, backed by Spanish support, against the crown. By 1603, the rebellion had collapsed. Defeated Ulster lords fled the country, abandoning their lands outright. For James, this was an opening too good to pass up. What followed, starting around 1605 and running for nearly a century, became known as the Plantation of Ulster. The Crown offered land grants across counties like Antrim, Down, Armagh, Tyrone, Donegal, Cavan, Fermanagh, and Derry to anyone willing to settle. This wasn't the first such scheme attempted, but it proved the most lasting. For Scots, especially lowlanders already struggling under crowded farmland and religious discrimination back home, this looked like a golden opportunity. As many as 200,000 Scots crossed the narrow North Channel over those 90 years. But the freedom they were promised came with strings attached. Most settlers worked as sharecroppers, barred from owning land outright, with no political voice whatsoever. And ironically, despite fleeing religious persecution, they were still required to tithe to the Anglican Church. Something unexpected happened anyway. As these transplanted Scots settled in beside native Irish communities, a genuinely new culture began forming. Neither fully Scottish nor fully Irish, but something distinct. That blended Ulster identity is exactly what their descendants would eventually carry across an ocean. By the 1690s, the situation in Ulster was deteriorating fast. A brutal famine swept through, and waves of fresh Scottish migrants poured into the region looking for relief, which only added more mouths to feed onto already strained land. Scottish Presbyterians had become the clear majority in Ulster by this point, yet that majority status bought them surprisingly little power. They were still squeezed from both directions. Catholic neighbors resented their presence and their faith, while the Anglican establishment officially in charge looked down on Presbyterianism as barely tolerable at best. Political representation remained completely out of reach, no matter how many of them there were. Numbers alone, it turned out, guaranteed absolutely nothing politically. Then came the economics, and economics rarely favor the tenant. As Ulster's population swelled, landlords realized they could charge whatever they wanted. Rents climbed sharply, year after year, squeezing families who had already given up everything once to cross the North Channel in the first place. Resentment toward the Church of England, which Presbyterian tenants were still forced to financially support through tithes, never faded. If anything, it deepened. For many ordinary families, a question started forming that hadn't seemed necessary a generation earlier. If Ulster wasn't truly free, and clearly it wasn't, was there somewhere else that actually might be? Word had been trickling back from across the Atlantic for years, stories of cheap land, no enforced tithe, and the kind of isolation that meant nobody official would be checking in on how you worshipped. For people who'd already proven willing to gamble everything on a single crossing once before, this looked less like a leap of faith and more like the obvious next move. Starting in the early 1700s, that question turned into action. A group history would eventually label the Scots-Irish began organizing passage to a continent most of them had never seen, chasing a promise that had already failed them once in Ulster. Whether it would actually hold up this time was anyone's guess. But staying put clearly wasn't working anymore, and that alone was reason enough to risk the ocean. One thing, before the final piece, everything I just showed you about the Scots-Irish bloodline is traceable inside your own DNA results. I wrote the guide for exactly that. It's called Where Do You Really Come From? Link is below. Now here's what nobody talks about. The first real wave crossed in 1718. A modest group of about 700 Presbyterian farmers and merchants from Ulster's Bann and Foyle valleys. The Bann Valley settlers pushed into the rough frontiers of Maine and New Hampshire, while the Foyle Valley group put down roots in Massachusetts. They were the opening act, not the finale. By the end of that same decade, another 2,600 had landed in New England alone, and still more were arriving directly in Virginia, fanning out across the Carolinas. In the decades leading up to the American Revolution, no immigrant group crossed the Atlantic in greater numbers than the Scots-Irish. By the 1770s, an estimated 250,000 of them were living scattered across the American colonies. Most were subsistence farmers chasing the same thing that had pulled them to Ulster generations earlier, cheap land and the freedom to worship without interference. But this time, they pushed further than anyone expected. Straight toward the frontier itself, the rougher the better. Thin soil, harsh winters, contested territory, none of it scared them off. If anything, isolation was the point. Colonial governments noticed and actively recruited these newcomers, dangling cheap frontier land in exchange for settling exactly where colonial leaders wanted a buffer between civilization and native nations. Nowhere did this arrangement take root more successfully than the southern Appalachians. Here, Scots-Irish families built a humble, sustainable life, and they didn't simply coexist with indigenous communities nearby. They intermarried with them, traded with them, and hunted alongside them. The deerskin trade flourished through partnerships with the Creek, the Cherokee, and the Choctaw, lasting well into the next century. One name captures this blending perfectly. James Adair, born in County Antrim, who lived among the Cherokee, left descendants there, and worked as a respected diplomat between colonial powers and southern tribes. His 1,775 book on Native American history is still considered an essential record of tribal language and custom today. It's also a quiet reminder that so many modern Americans carrying Scots-Irish DNA are, often knowingly or not, also carrying indigenous ancestry alongside it as well. So what does all of this actually look like in a modern DNA test? This is where the Scotland's DNA Project, led by geneticist Jim Wilson at the University of Edinburgh, comes in. Their work remains one of the most thorough. By analyzing samples from nearly 1,000 Scots, the project mapped the country into 6 distinct genetic clusters: the Borders, the Southwest, the Hebrides, the Northeast, Orkney, and Shetland. That Northeast-Southwest split we talked about earlier, the one tracing back to Picts and Gaels, showed up clearly in the data, confirming that ancient tribal boundary never really disappeared. But some of the findings went well beyond expected territory. Around 1% of Scots, the research found, descend directly from Berber tribesmen out of the Sahara, a lineage stretching back roughly 5,600 years. The theory is that this DNA spread first to Spain during the Moorish period, then up along the Atlantic coast through France, and finally into Scotland. Separately, genetic markers tied to the Yamnaya culture, originating in the steppe region of what's now Ukraine and southern Russia, also turned up in the Scottish population, especially concentrated in Orkney, evidence of migration that happened roughly 5,000 years ago. Then there's the surname research. Among participants carrying the name Stuart, 15% turned out to be direct descendants of Scotland's royal line, carrying what researchers nicknamed royal DNA. And perhaps strangest of all, the study uncovered traces of the Meate, a tribe that fought Roman legions back in 208 AD and then seemingly vanished from the historical record by the 8th century. DNA analysis found a distinctive genetic marker still clustered tightly around Stirling and the foothills nearby, exactly where the Meate once lived. None of this stayed locked away in Scotland. Every one of these markers, Pictish, Norse, Berber, Yamnaya, Royal Stuart, Meate, traveled across the Atlantic embedded in the Ulster Scots who settled Appalachia. Anyone with deep Appalachian roots taking a modern DNA test today is statistically carrying pieces of every single one of these ancient migrations, whether they ever knew it or not. All of this ancient genetic layering eventually had its moment to prove itself, and it happened on a battlefield. On the 7th of October 1780, at the Battle of Kings Mountain in South Carolina, descendants of Scots-Irish settlers from Tennessee and Virginia faced down Loyalist militia forces and won decisively. Thomas Jefferson himself later called it the turn of the tide of success in the Revolutionary War. That fighting spirit, inherited from centuries of border conflict, plantation hardship, and frontier survival, didn't show up by accident. Generations of being squeezed by landlords, monarchs, and distant governments had taught these people exactly one enduring lesson: trust no one above you and rely entirely on family and neighbors instead. So where did all of these bloodlines end up settling permanently? Mostly right where they started, in Appalachia. Today, North Carolina holds the highest percentage of Scots-Irish ancestry of any state in the country at 2.9% of the population. South Carolina and Tennessee follow closely behind at 2.4% each. But the real proof isn't sitting in a census table. It's woven, quite literally, into Appalachian quilts, where every pattern still tells a family story passed down through generations. It's baked into the food: chow chow, hoe cakes, chicken fried steak, biscuits and gravy, dishes that trace back to necessity and isolation as much as taste. It's distilled, sometimes a little too literally, into moonshine traditions that go back to the same suspicion of outside authority their ancestors carried across the Atlantic. It's played out in fiddle music and bluegrass, and danced out in buck dancing, an echo of Irish folk dances performed 3 centuries ago on a different continent entirely. And it shows up in something harder to measure but impossible to miss: a certain attitude. Blunt, practical, fiercely independent, and just a little suspicious of anyone claiming authority over them. None of that came from nowhere. It traveled through Pictish resistance, Norse raids, plantation hardship, and frontier survival, and it landed, fully intact, in the hollows of Appalachia. The DNA test simply confirmed what the culture had been quietly proving the entire time. So that's the real story, the one buried under 300 years of myth, fiddle tunes, and family legend. The Scots-Irish who settled Appalachia weren't a simple people with a simple bloodline. They carried Pictish resistance, Norse raids, Beaker DNA, Berber ancestry, and even traces of a forgotten tribe called the Meade, all stitched together long before anyone ever boarded a ship. Then they added Cherokee, Creek, and Choctaw ancestry once they arrived, building something entirely new in the hollows of Appalachia. And that complexity is exactly what makes this heritage worth exploring. If you're of Scots-Irish descent, you're not just carrying one story, you're carrying dozens of them, layered on top of each other across thousands of years. Obviously, this is a massive topic, and there's no way to cover every thread of it in one video. If you've got family stories, old photographs, or pieces of this history passed down in your own household, I'd genuinely love to read about them in the comments below.